Okay. Oh, great. We already have some people in. Good evening, everybody. I will let everybody filter into the Zoom room before we begin officially. Oh my gosh, so many people coming in. It's so good to have you all this evening. We'll just allow some more time for people to enter the room. You are in the right place, I promise. We're just waiting a few moments for everybody to get into the room. Okay. I think we've actually reached something of a plateau. We can begin. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to PNP Live. My name is Beth Wong. I'm on the events team at Politics and Prose, and we thank you so much for joining us here this evening to celebrate the release of The Failed Promise, a new book by Robert Levine. At any time during the event tonight, you can click on the link that I'm going to post in our chat to purchase copies of tonight's book from PNP. In addition to growing your own library, a book sale from PNP means that we are able to keep bringing content like this to our community, content that we're so proud of. Please do support this pillar of DC literary culture. You can ask our author a question tonight by submitting it to the Q&A box, the button for which can be found near the bottom of your screen. Be sure to submit any questions to the Q&A and not to the chat to make sure our moderator and author see it. Tonight we are offering live auto captioning. To turn that on or off, go to the little arrow on the closed caption button below or to the settings of your Zoom mobile app. If you need help with that, send me a message in the chat and I can talk you through it. But I will waste no more time getting to the main event. This evening we bring you a conversation about The Failed Promise. In this new book, distinguished university professor of English and distinguished scholar teacher at the University of Maryland College Park, Robert S. Levine, foregrounds the viewpoints of Black Americans on Reconstruction in his absorbing account of the struggle between the great orator Frederick Douglass and President Andrew Johnson. Levine will be in conversation with Richard Bell, professor of history at the University of Maryland and author of the new book Stolen: 5 Free Boys Kidnapped into Slavery and Their Astonishing Odyssey Home. Professor Bell is teaching an upcoming class for Politics and Prose as well, called Reading the American Revolutionaries, and I'm going to put that info in the chat as well. Welcome to you both. The floor is yours.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you to everyone who's joining us tonight. I'm watching the numbers just tick up and up and up. It's hard to know whether it's the attractions of Frederick Douglass or the controversies around Andrew Johnson or around our author, Bob Levine, this evening that bring people out. But we are glad you're here. It's a great privilege for me to be in conversation with my friend Bob, who we both teach at the University of Maryland. And I want to get straight into one of the central scenes in this new book, Bob, about the interactions between Frederick Douglass and President Andrew Johnson in the context of Reconstruction. And that's the day they met. On, I think it was February the 7th, 1866, Frederick Douglass and a squad of other Black civil rights leaders had an audience with President Andrew Johnson at the White House. And famously, it did not go well at all. By some accounts, Johnson, the president, spent most of his time singing his own praises, and at one point comparing himself to Moses, a Moses for African Americans, believe it or not, and no one else got much of a word in. And then when the delegation had departed, Johnson called Frederick Douglass the N-word behind his back. So that infamous 1866 meeting is a pivot point around which this terrific new book, The Failed Promise, turns. So can we start there? Why had that delegation come, Bob? What were they hoping to achieve? Did they get what they wanted? And just to put a point on this, you have a stenographer, don't you, in the room taking, it seems like, copious notes about this interaction. And at one point, Frederick Douglass smiles. What on earth was there to smile about?
Right. So that's a great question. And before I answer it, I want to thank Politics and Prose. This is the second time I've been invited to speak at Politics and Prose. And I want to thank Rick Bell, who, is responsible for half of the attendance here probably today and asks great questions. And so I want to address that scene. I want to say that it's one of my favorite scenes in the book. And I want to kind of move backward and then forward into the scene. So actually, the first time you could argue that Douglass met Johnson was at the second inauguration of Abraham Lincoln. And at that moment, according to Douglass in Life and Times, he got a glance from Johnson that revealed him as a racist, someone who was not going to be a friend of African Americans. In the book, I raised questions about that whole account because Douglass wrote it about 20 years after it happened. The fact is that Douglass had some problems with Lincoln, and a lot of people thought that Johnson was a promising president. He was a Union Southerner, pro-Union Southerner. He came out against slavery in 1863. People like Charles Sumner, after the assassination, thought that Johnson was going to be a great president who was going to support voting rights. So that takes us to about May 29, 1865, when Andrew Johnson announces an amnesty for Confederate fighters and suddenly, and Confederate supporters, and suddenly Douglass and other abolitionist types were really alienated by Johnson. So we kind of follow it through 1865. Johnson kind of goes back and forth between reaching out to Black people and resisting radical Republican legislation and policy. In December of 1865, at a Black convention, Frederick Douglass proposes that Blacks create a lobbying group and go to Washington, D.C. and talk to congressmen and talk to President Johnson. And back then, you could talk to presidents a little bit more easily than you could now. And earlier, Douglass had visited Lincoln twice during Lincoln's first administration. So they show up in February. I think that Charles Sumner helped to get them an audience. The delegation is led by someone named George Downing, who is a Black kind of restaurateur and based in Washington, D.C. And Johnson invited this Black group there because he wanted to show them that he really liked Black people. And as he announced in October 1864 in Tennessee, that I am your Moses, I am going to be on your side and help you. The stenographer is interesting. The stenographer is James Clephane, who had developed one of the first sophisticated shorthand systems. And Johnson wanted him there because he thought that he would be a great performer. And the way I present this, and as I say in the book early on, I'm a literary scholar, I kind of read this in terms of performance studies. So it starts out with the Black visitors. There's about 10 of them. Making their respectful comments, and then Johnson launches into a speech, and then he's interrupted, and he gets a little bit edgy, and then they move towards completion, and then as they're walking out, Douglass turns to Johnson and says something to the effect of, "You are not enfranchising or paying proper attention to your friends," and he sets Johnson off. There's a back and forth, and Johnson, who is so level-headed and has all this equanimity, is suddenly talking about wanting to colonize Black people, get them out of the country. And I think this is exactly what Douglass wanted. So in the book, I think it's a dramatic scene. It ends with the Black delegation finally leaving, and then they immediately go to a hotel room and write up a response to the meeting, which is published the next day in the Washington newspaper. So they beat Johnson by almost a week because Johnson did his own response a week later. James Clephane was so skilled as a stenographer that a transcript of the meeting appeared that night in a Washington newspaper. It was reprinted the next day in a Washington newspaper with some corrections and with the response of the Black delegation framing it. And Frederick Douglass in Life and Times argues that this was a transformative moment, that people finally got to see what this person was all about. With the help of digital tools available at the University of Maryland Library, I was able to trace that this article was then rapidly reprinted throughout the country. It ended up in newspapers in Nevada, in California. And so it brought a lot of publicity, but it wasn't the kind of publicity that Johnson wanted. And as you say, he said to some arguably disloyal person in the White House, he used the N-word. He also said that Frederick Douglass is the kind of Black person who wants to cut off your throat. And he's, one of the things I argue in the overall book is that he's obsessed with Douglass, and he's kind of shadowing Douglass as Douglass is shadowing Johnson. So by the end of the chapter, I show how Johnson supporters are attacking Douglass, Douglass supporters and the Christian Recorder are celebrating the Black delegation and turning against Johnson. And believe it or not, I could keep talking, but I might stop there.
So you've taken us deep into that scene and then played it out in different ways, and the ways in which you're a literary scholar and the tools you bring to that are very obvious from hearing you talk about this. Maybe you could take folks back into Johnson's biography a little bit more, because one of the things I have a sense of is that at this point in American history, Frederick Douglass is by far the better known of the two figures in this book. My wife has a Ph.D. from a very good university, didn't know Andrew Johnson was a president until quite recently. She thought he was Andrew Jackson. So Andrew Johnson, how does this guy who by a certain point will have these completely toxic racial politics, which will be anathema to so many people around him, how does he end up on Lincoln's ticket in the Lincoln's re-election campaign in 1864?
Right. So, I mean, it's a great question, and it kind of points to another thing that I really like about the book, and that I think I learned about by doing this book. So, Andrew Johnson, until Donald Trump, arguably, has been regarded as one of the worst presidents in the United States, and I'm all with that. And I think that the racism is horrible. But one thing I did is, and I'm sure you've done this before, Rick, is I read through the 15 volumes of the Johnson papers, and I found some really interesting things about Johnson. So I think one of the risks that I took in the book is to not make it a kind of Manichaean thing where there's Douglass the good guy and Johnson the bad guy right at the start, though I think by the end, Douglass is the good guy and Johnson is the bad guy, but he's also kind of pitiable. And that's a word that I got from W.E.B. Du Bois, because Du Bois thought that Johnson had a lot of promise. So the book starts out with Douglass and Johnson at the second inauguration. And I try to be a little bit cinematic about that. I then pose the question, what brought the two of them there? And so I start out with a chapter on Andrew Johnson, and it conveys the kinds of things that I learned about him and was kind of surprised about. He was a self-made man. He was a tailor. He was into good clothes. He was, by many accounts, a terrific orator. He was a Southerner from Tennessee when he became, he held lots of political offices in Tennessee, but became a senator. He basically championed a pro-Southern line, but in 1861, he broke from the South and from the people that seceded, and gave a pro-union speech in Congress that Charles Sumner ordered 500 copies of. You know, he thought, this guy's great. He takes, you know, he puts his life on the line taking that position. He's giving lots of speeches around the South and the Midwest supporting the Union cause. in 1863, he decides he's anti-slavery. And as I discuss in the book, he did have some enslaved people in the 1850s, but in 1863, it goes online and says, I support the Emancipation Proclamation and a constitutional amendment to end slavery. At this point, it doesn't sound so bad, that he's coming from within his particular culture and adopting pro-union and anti-slavery views. Lincoln makes him the military governor of Tennessee in 1862. In 1864, there's a lot of concern among the Republicans, and they now call themselves the National Union Party, that Lincoln's going to lose the election. So he gets rid of his current VP, who is from Maine, and he asks Johnson to be vice president. And Johnson probably helped him. And then, as I detail in the book, when Lincoln is assassinated, there's actually some Republicans who are happy because they thought they would be in better hands with Johnson. And I'm able to show that through diaries and other kinds of supporting textual materials. And that doesn't really change, like letters. That doesn't change until late May, when people are suddenly thinking, who is this guy? And later, during this whole crisis, I don't know if you're going to ask me about this later, Frederick Douglass decides that it's almost like like there was this conspiracy that Johnson pretended he was anti-slavery, but John Wilkes Booth and other people knew he was on their side. And that's why Lincoln was killed. And he argues this in a speech called Sources of Danger to the Republic. And that, Douglass says, is why we should get rid of the vice presidency, because vice presidents are going to be tempted to kill the president so they can become president. And when he presented this idea to a Black audience in Philadelphia, according to the newspaper account, there was a lot of laughter.
Well, I'm glad to hear there's laughter, because we've got conspiracy theories and leakers in the White House, right? It all seems so familiar. But let's get into the stakes here, because the other part of this three-legged stool is Reconstruction itself. The Reconstruction of the post-Civil War South, something that arguably Black leaders, Republicans in Congress, and President Johnson himself all agree is a priority, but none of them seem to agree what Reconstruction should actually mean. So what were the stakes, and how was Johnson's vision of Reconstruction different from Douglass's?
Right, so there's different stakes, and I'll start with Johnson, move to Douglass, and say a few words about the Radical Republicans, who I kind of play down in this book. I highlight a few, but the book is different from something like Brenda Wineapple's The Impeachers, which talks a lot about the Radical Republicans. Andrew Johnson argued that there shouldn't be Reconstruction, and he didn't like to use the word Reconstruction. He used the word restoration. And he made an argument that Brenda Wineapple says is kind of crazy, and I'm pretty much with her, that it depends on a kind of mystical sense of the Union, that there cannot be secession. There's no such thing because the Constitution doesn't allow for secession. It's kind of crazy because the states, in fact, did secede. So in his first annual message to Congress in December 1865, he doesn't use the word Reconstruction. He uses the word restoration. And basically, as the Amnesty Proclamation made clear, he was ready just to restore all of the Confederate states with no changes at all, except that they have to accept the end of slavery. He did not come up with a plan for Black representation or Black citizenship. So he uses the word restoration. Thaddeus Stevens, I guess I'll get to Douglass. Thaddeus Stevens, Radical Republican, used the word Reconstruction, and in summer speeches of 1865, talked about the South as basically they're prisoners of war. They lost a war. We have a right to reconstruct them along the economic and moral lines of Northern society. So the Republicans are pushing for Black rights, Black election rights. Douglass sometimes thought they were doing that in self-interested ways and weren't pushing that as hard as perhaps making sure that the Southern ex-Confederate states were subordinate to the Northern states. Frederick Douglass at a meeting, a May meeting of 1865 of the American Anti-Slavery Society says something that I think is really crucial, and that is, and I'm quoting, slavery is not abolished until the Black man has the ballot. And he's obsessed with that. He's angry at the Republicans because the 14th Amendment did not make sure the Blacks could have the vote. He argues that the violence in Memphis and New Orleans in 1866 was the result of Blacks not having the vote, that Blacks needed representation. Blacks needed to be citizens. They deserve that. In the book, you could argue it gets a little bit repetitious because every chapter I'm talking about Douglass's emphasis on the vote, which gets a little bit problematic near 1868 because he's talking at women's rights conventions and saying Black men should get the vote, and he's asking women to be patient and let the Black men get the vote first, and that led to some tension. So you have restoration, and also Johnson's idea was it's presidential restoration. He would be in charge. You have congressional reconstruction, in which there's a whole lot of changes that are made to the South. And you have Douglass and other Black leaders most forcefully pushing for Blacks' right to vote, which they got by 1870, but then pretty quickly found it almost impossible to vote. So that's the aspect of the book that early readers of the book have picked up on. Because when I was writing this book, I was thinking about Trump and impeachment. I didn't know that Georgia, Texas, and other places were going to try to find ways to restrict Black voting rights. So, you know, if you abolish or kind of push back on those rights, Douglass would say you're kind of bringing us back to the time of slavery.
Yeah, the stakes seem like they could not be higher in this, critical 12 years. I sometimes tell my undergraduate students at Maryland that those 12 years are the most important 12 years in American history, because there's at least two incredibly important questions being fought over simultaneously. And maybe they're even the same question. One is about the future of the Union. Will it hold together, or will there be Civil War Part 2, Secession Round 2? What will happen to all those people who were pointing guns at us just a few months ago? The white Confederates. And then at the same time, what will become of the 4 million formerly enslaved individuals in a country where slavery is now illegal after the 13th Amendment, December 1865, but in which the master remains, right? The person that enslaved them is still that guy over there. And he would be quite happy to exploit you in other economic ways, which might leave you in slave-like conditions without maybe direct government interference. The stakes are extraordinary.
And you may have wanted to ask a question, but I just want to jump in there. Andrew Johnson is a complex, interesting person. So he leaves the White House. He's not convicted. You know, he's impeached but not convicted. And he runs for Congress in Tennessee, and he's speaking to Black audiences. And I think that the idea must be that there was some voting rights by that point. And he's saying two things. First is, I am your Moses. And he actually pulls out newspaper accounts and shows them. So, you know, one way of talking about that is he's kind of crazed. The other thing he does is this incredible speech where he says, we've gone from slavery to peonage. And what's the difference? I'm on your side. You know, we need to give you better opportunities. And in terms of, you know, the kind of stereotypical ways that a lot of us think about Johnson, that he is pure evil, where did this come from? You know, where did that insight come from? And that's the kind of thing that Douglass starts talking about. I have an epilogue that traces Douglass to his death in 1895. He gives some speeches talking about how if Blacks are regarded as inferior in America, going back to the 17th century, you have these ingrained ways of thinking, and he starts talking realistically. It's going to be difficult to move as quickly as we would like, or at least that's what he saw, or at least he's trying to understand that. He's not trying to rationalize that, but he's trying to understand that. And one other quick thing I'd say is that I'm working on a collection of essays on the Reconstruction novelist Albion Tourget, who was a big admirer of Douglass. And Tourget says some similar things about caste and prejudice and how hard it is to break it in the South following, in the years 1870 on.
Let's stay with Douglass, if we might. You've written more than one prior book to great acclaim about Douglass, most recently a sort of literary study of the three different autobiographies called The Lives of Frederick Douglass, I think published in 2016. So what does this new book in which you engage with Douglass, again, tell readers about Douglass that we didn't already know? Or did your view of Douglass shift any as a result of watching him watch Andrew Johnson?
Right. My views of Douglass shift almost every day, which means I can keep working on him. He's interesting. There's contradictions, all that kind of thing. The first Douglass book I published was back in 1997, and that was on Frederick Douglass and Martin Delany and issues of representative leadership. And I have an epilogue in that book in which I basically kind of blow away Douglass. I just say, he became a Republican. He's totally uninteresting. The end, okay? Then the next Douglass book, I got really most fascinated by the third autobiography. He brought out two editions in 1881 and 1892. I had not taken it seriously before because obviously, 1997, I said, he just became a Republican hack, that's it. I found the autobiography fascinating and I kind of read with it and against it. There are stories he tells that you can show aren't true. You can show pragmatically why he's making those stories. So I want to show how, even as my view of Douglass is shifting, his view of himself and how to tell his story is shifting. And that's the emphasis of the 2016 book. This is a different kind of book because it doesn't offer a lot of readings in the same way as my earlier book. But this is a Douglass I knew nothing about until I started to pursue this. The Douglass of the early years of Reconstruction. And among the many things that interest me about Douglass is the way that he links himself with other Black activists. And you probably know the William McFeely biography from 1991 is basically Douglass wanted to be a white man, and he reads him in relation to the white family. There's very little about connections to Delany, Downing, other major Black figures. So I'm interested in Douglass as a leader on the one hand, but during this period, he's working as that chapter on the Black delegation visiting Johnson suggests, working with other Black people, someone who's really politically engaged in a very specific way. And I wanted to enrich my understanding of that Douglass that I thought wasn't interesting back in 1997. And I found month by month really interesting things in terms of his speeches, his writings, his interactions with other Black people, and the way he's following Johnson and trying to influence policy. And also, this is something that I also emphasize, he's trying to influence the Republican leaders who at times, as I present them in this book, come off as pretty racist themselves. So another large argument that I make in the book that's related to my thinking about Douglass is there's racism in the North. Northerners are voting against Black suffrage between 1865 and 1868. Even Thaddeus Stevens a pragmatic politician, did not want Frederick Douglass at a Republican convention in 1866. So, and then Douglass publishes 2 essays in the Atlantic magazine in 1867. In a way, they address more the Republicans and the failure he believed at the time of the 14th Amendment, because it gave some Blacks birthright citizenship. But he said, where is the stuff about voting and why is that being ignored? So an activist Douglass, who's out there politically, who's doing interesting things as a speaker, who is working with other Black activists and is having a real impact on the culture.
Thank you. And I'll just remind folks out there that we're going to have time for questions a bit later on from you. So if you haven't already, do pop them in the Q&A box. I see a few there already. We'd love to get some more to work through in the time that remains. But I want to circle back to one of the themes that you've brought up, Bob, in your answers so far, which is that, you know, you're a literary scholar. You bring that sensibility and that method, you know, series of tools and methodological agendas into the work you do on a project which from a distance might seem like a political history and a personal history. What are some of the other ways in which your background in the study of English literature and language has informed this particular book on Douglass and Johnson?
That's a good question. And I think something interesting about you is that you're a historian who writes about literature too. I mean, your first book is read by literary scholars, and your book Stolen, which I can see behind you, and it's behind me as well, is a real skillful narrative performance. It's not, it doesn't have long chapters that begin with analysis and then goes to archives. It tells a story. So I tried to do that same sort of thing in this book. It's kind of using my literary skills, but also my ambition when I was a graduate student to be a novelist, which didn't turn out, but I wanted to tell a story and I wanted to use short chapters and I wanted it to read kind of like your book. And one thing that I would point out is that our 2 books are each right around 320 pages. A lot of history books tend to be 500 to 800 pages. Those are the ones that seem to win prizes sometimes. So yeah, I'm a real interest in using narrative as a form of analysis. So it's not just the storytelling, but that you choose your details that help you to develop an argument. I do have one chapter that I do not think would appear in a book by a historian, and that's almost a full-length chapter of one single speech by Douglass, the 1867 Sources of Danger to the Republic, which is a speech he gave on multiple occasions, but early on gave to a Black lecture series run by William Still, the great abolitionist and Underground Railroad person in Philadelphia. And I had discovered with the help of a friend a transcript of that speech. The Frederick Douglass papers from Yale have the version that Douglass gave in February to a white audience in St. Louis. So I was interested, again, as a literary scholar, to look closely at what he's saying in that speech and how he's using rhetoric and what does he do with a Black audience? What does he do with a white audience? With the Black audience, he talks about Massa Johnson to laughter, according to the newspaper transcription. To the white audience, he appeals to the talent of Anglo-Saxons, as he puts it, to bring an end or to help to promote the kind of Reconstruction that he wanted. And I think the other thing that I did as a literary scholar is take those 15 volumes of Johnson's writings very seriously and look for leitmotifs, look at how he uses language, use some speeches as a way of talking about his insecurities, his defensiveness, that kind of thing. So I'd say there's a lot of attention to words. And David Blight is someone who also, I think, can kind of cross back and forth between being a literary scholar and a historian. I've been at several conferences with him. And he pays attention to words in his biography and actually talks about Douglass as a man of words early on in that excellent biography. So yeah, an attention to language and an attention to a certain kind of analytical storytelling, which I worked my way towards, because my first draft was a traditional kind of academic scholarly thing with long chapters and deductive openings to each chapter that my editor at Norton said, hey, you're taking away the suspense. Why should they even read the chapter? So I kind of learned stuff as I read this.
And so, so much of the scholarly work and expertise that you bring to this is sort of buried in the sentences you've crafted, which are led, by plot and by character and suspense. Right. This is a page turner, ladies and gentlemen, folks, about the politics of Reconstruction right after the Civil War. Very skillfully crafted. Let me pick up on two more things before we pivot to questions from other folks joining us. In the thumbnail version of Reconstruction, it seems that many people are willing to lay the bulk of the blame for the failure of federal Reconstruction on Andrew Johnson's shoulders. Did Douglass do that?
There's evidence to answer both ways. So in the epilogue, I show how Douglass is concerned from 1870 until his death in 1895, that we keep returning to the Andrew Johnson moment. And I think in invoking that moment, he is suggesting, that Andrew Johnson might be at fault. Now, he's doing this after 1875 when Andrew Johnson is dead. And it's not as if everything changes. And in fact, I point out in the book that right as the impeachment hearing is underway, Douglass is attacked by someone using the N-word in Connecticut at a hotel. And Douglass is really upset with New York State, for not supporting suffrage. That has nothing to do with Andrew Johnson. So I think he goes back and forth. And I think that in the historiography, people go back and forth. So I've had people read the book and say, it's all Johnson, he's evil, things would have been better without Johnson. Sure, that's probably true. But when Lincoln was assassinated, he was almost in the same place as Andrew Johnson. He just was a better politician and he seemed to listen. So one assumes things would have changed. One assumption that I make, and I'm not a historian, so I can make crazy assumptions, is that the 14th and 15th Amendments wouldn't have been passed as early as they were passed if Lincoln had been president. Maybe because they would have been necessary, maybe because Lincoln would have made signals that we're moving towards that, but that we don't need these amendments quite yet. I would say by the end of the book, I come down a bit more on the side, and I see Douglass kind of saying this too, that there are larger structural, psychological, whatever, racist issues that slowed down Reconstruction. And even when these amendments are passed, and Ulysses S. Grant becomes president, supposedly sympathetic to Black people, it is hard to continue to make progress. So I don't want to say it's just Johnson, but I'm totally sympathetic to people who want to make that argument.
I think I'm going to pick up on that later on, and maybe as a last question before we throw things back after some audience questions. But let's stay with this current theme, the sort of what ifs. From reading the book, I know you're quite comfortable exploring some what ifs. And Frank Davies has a question which I'm going to read to you, another what if, to get your feedback on. If Johnson had been removed from office by the Senate, what are the ways Reconstruction might have played out differently?
Well, that's a good question. And actually, I have a book that came out in 2008 called Dislocating Race and Nation, where I make an argument for counterfactual thinking. So, I'm kind of into that. It's very hard to say. And again, I don't have all of the historical knowledge at my fingertips, but what I argue in the book is that the reason Republicans didn't want to remove him, and maybe there's a couple of reasons, and I think actually that there was a conspiracy among Republicans to make sure that it was a one vote difference. I mean, he wasn't convicted by one vote. Benjamin Wade would have become president. Benjamin Wade was hated by the Republican Party. Benjamin Wade used the N-word from the 1850s until the 1870s, said that it made him sick eating food cooked by Black people, who he referred to with the N-word. Republicans thought that Ulysses S. Grant would be the much better president to support Reconstruction. They thought if Wade became president, that he would control the nominating convention and that there would be a decent chance that Grant wouldn't become president. So, my answer is that Wade would have been president and the Republicans would have felt they were in crisis. So what actually happened is you have a strong negative vote, loss of confidence in Johnson without removing him by convicting him. And he has a few months, like 6 months left as president, where I argue that he's fairly impotent. I know one historian who disagrees with that. So there is debate about that. But I think, I'm not sure what would have happened, but I know the Republicans thought things would be worse with Wade. So they made their statement with that one vote difference and kept Wade in check. And Wade was also a socialist. And the Republican Party was linking themselves to the so-called Gilded Age. So they didn't want a socialist as president either. So maybe, we would have developed a class-free country if Wade had become president.
One can hope. So we're going to jump around a bit because the nature of the questions coming in from folks, we're going to jump around a bit. Vivian, hello, Vivian. I know Vivian. Going back to the first story about that delegation of Black men meeting with Johnson at the White House, Vivian wants to know, was that new? Would such a meeting have been possible before the war, or is that an example of a significant change right after the war regarding the spaces newly open to Black men? Could a delegation like that have gone publicly to Lincoln or to Buchanan or anyone else back in the day? How far does this tradition of a delegation of Black men going to the White House go back?
I'm going to say counterfactually that a Black delegation could have visited Lincoln if it was set up by someone in the Republican Party. So during Lincoln's administration, he met twice with Frederick Douglass. He also met with Martin Delany, who was a radical Black nationalist. And interestingly, Lincoln chose Delany to be the first Black major in the Union Army because he liked his commitment to violence. He actually asked Delany, how can we get Black people in the South to use violence against their putative masters? So I don't know of occasions of delegations visiting Lincoln, but I wouldn't be surprised if he entertained, say, a church group or something like that. In an early chapter in this book, and let me just, it's a chapter called A Moses in the White House. I discuss groups after groups, Black groups that visit Johnson. And he always has things under control. I mean, that's the interesting thing. So John Langston, who became the first dean of Howard Law School, visited with the delegation, I think in April. There were delegations from North Carolina. He would publicize that he was having these meetings. He allowed Black people to have access to the White House lawns for July 4th for an emancipation celebration. And when Douglass visited, the thing that I emphasize is that having that stenographer there, he thought this was going to be another one of those meetings where everything goes well and he's in control. He had a speech that he wanted to give. Frederick Douglass in Life and Times says he spoke for about an hour. The transcript does not suggest that, but maybe 20 years later, it seemed to Douglass like an hour. they did interrupt the speech, according to the surviving transcript. And the quote that Rick mentioned, in which Johnson refers to Douglass in the N-word, that's after the meeting. And he's just so angry, that it got out of control.
So picking up on something that Bradley's asking about, he's asking about your most productive sources. And I think you've already sort of touched on some of the richest sources coming out of Douglass's pen in relation to these issues. What about for Johnson? If you sent people home tonight with some homework to read one thing by Andrew Johnson, what would it be?
It might be fun to read his speech from mid-October 1864. In which he's at the Capitol in Knoxville. I think maybe it's Nashville, where he is at the time, and he announces that all of the Blacks in Tennessee were free, because they were not freed by the Emancipation Proclamation, because they were regarded as a border state. You get to see a couple things. You get to see the excitement that he has, that he can be the person that frees Black people. You also get to see how much he's admired by Black people, because according to the transcripts that are published in newspapers, he says to the crowd, "You need a Moses." And they shout back, "You will be our Moses." And he shouts back at them, "But, one of you should be the Moses." And they shout back, "You're the Moses." Then he says, "Okay, I'll be your Moses." So that's an interesting moment. I want to mention one other resource that I found really valuable, and that is the Christian Recorder. And that's the newspaper of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. It was also a cultural organ. I've read as much as I could about the impeachment. No one has ever referred to it, even Brenda Wineapple. The Christian Recorder is tracing various Black responses to Johnson from 1865 to 1868, starting in 1865, that this guy's going to be great. And they reprint the Moses speech that I'm recommending. And I think you could probably find that speech online. It's not until early 1866 that they're disillusioned. And that's when they print the transcript of the Black delegation's visit. And then you can follow, and they write some really funny stories and aggressive stories about Johnson. So I had access to that digitally and was able to go through it. But there are a lot of people working in African American studies now who see that as one of the great sources for a Black perspective. And the other is the transcripts from Black conventions, which are available online at a website called the Black Conventions Project. So a bunch of sources, but I'd say for Johnson, I would say the speeches from 1863 to 1865, before he becomes president. And then if you want the really horrible, obnoxious Johnson, read his annual messages to Congress.
And I think you said the third one was the doozy, is that right?
Yeah, and Foner calls it the most racist statement that ever came out of the White House. He does not say that in that same speech, Johnson says we need to find ways for Black people to get jobs and rise in the culture. So he's a contradictory person, because he's saying, go ahead.
Speaking of exactly this, I'm going to paraphrase something that Craig Howell's writing in the Q&A. Is it fair to say that Johnson was anti-slavery, but also anti-Black, or is it still much more complicated even than that?
Can I quote myself? This is what I write this. I was one quote. I have trouble remembering what I wrote. He was a racist who believed strongly that he cared about Black people. And that's the kind of weird thing about him. I think in that third message to Congress, he talks about the danger of Africanizing the country. I mean, there's just nothing more obnoxious, hateful, and racist that you can read. Right around the same time, Sam, a person who is a former slave, writes him and asks for money so he can buy property to build a school for Black children in Tennessee. And Johnson, who hates the Freedmen's Bureau, and this would be connected to the Freedmen's Bureau, gives him the land. So, what's going on? So just when you think you have him totally pigeonholed, he can seem warm in various ways, complex in various ways, arguing against peonage, and as racist as anyone you will ever read about at certain moments. And I also think he hated the radical Republicans because in 1865, he proposes limited Black suffrage, which is exactly what Lincoln proposed. And then he seems to back off because he hates Thaddeus Stevens and he hates Benjamin Wade. And he says in his Swing Around the Circle, this famous lecture tour that he gave in late 1866, that they should be hung. They're the traitors. So some real animus against the North. And he was a person who hated the Southern enslavers because he saw them as aristocrats and he was this self-made man. But then as president, he seems increasingly to align himself with them.
And just to pick up on that, he seems like a man of very strong feelings. He hates a lot of different things and seems to hold grudges and bear animosity with extraordinary depth. And it seems to influence his policy proposals.
Right.
We tend to think that
in that way, he's a completely atypical politician. Andrew Cuomo never behaved that way. Trump never behaved that way.
How dare you? Gary is writing something in the Q&A here, which is making me think of something related. So I'm going to pose it as my final question to you today. And you've not been shy about drawing parallels to our modern day, Bob, which has given me confidence to ask this. So in the epilogue, which I found very moving, you write that, quote, Andrew Johnson was not unique. There would be more Johnsons to come, and Douglass knew that. So the last question I want to ask you tonight is, how did writing this book leave you feeling about the prospects for racial justice in our time?
Mixed, but also a sense that we can learn from the past, that Douglass continues to speak to us. And I'm going to give a short answer to this question. I do reveal in the epilogue that I was thinking about Donald Trump, but he is not named anywhere in the book. I call him the nameless one because that's what Douglass in one of his speeches called Andrew Johnson. I end the book with a passage from one of Douglass's better known and greatest speeches, Lessons of the Hour, which is a speech he gave in 1894 in response to the rise of lynching in the United States. And the speech ends very poetically, that we still have our ideals and I'm not giving up hope. And I haven't memorized that paragraph. I would love to read it. But it's that kind of stuff in Douglass that keeps me hopeful. And I think that this kind of work and thinking can be very helpful to go back to Reconstruction and think about what Reconstruction was about, what the promise was, what the failures were, and how even in 2021, we are repeating some of the same problems. Maybe there's a way out through some of Douglass's rhetoric and just knowing what the problems and the issues were.
So the book is titled The Failed Promise, and Andrew Johnson fell short of the expectations placed upon him by a surprisingly broad cross-section of the American people, including many Black leaders, including Douglass himself. But the promise of racial justice, of course, still endures, and we all have responsibility to try to fulfill.
And the first word of the subtitle is Reconstruction. And the initial title is The Failed Promise of Reconstruction. And I like that Norton marketing changed that because it made it more evocative. It's about Johnson, it's about Reconstruction. It can be about other failed promises too.
Well, folks, this is an extraordinary book. Bob is a superlative scholar, and as you will learn when you open this on page 1, he's also a brilliant and gifted writer. I do hope you take a look at this new book, The Failed Promise. Publication date is today, and I'm going to hand things back to Beth.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for this excellent conversation. I do have from Politics and Prose one final question to ask you both. There are a lot of people in the audience interested in your research methods, your research materials. I would love to know what you both are reading right now. Professor Levine, can we start with you?
Well, I'll tell you what I just finished. I mostly read fiction. I mean, I don't read history except if I'm going to write a book about Douglass and Reconstruction. And I like mystery novels during the summer. And 20 years ago, I bought a paperback, a vintage contemporary edition of James Crumley's The Last Good Kiss. And it's been sitting on my to-read pile for a while. And this is what it looks like. I want to say a word or two about it. The blurb from the Rolling Stone is The Last Good Mystery. It came out in 1978. The vintage book came out in 1988. And it's in the style of Raymond Chandler. And I think he really pulls it off. It also is really good on California in the late 70s and early 80s. And I was actually there at the time. I like it as much as Vineland for that reason. But the big reason to read the book, if you go back to the cover here, if you see that bulldog, the bulldog is an alcoholic. The bulldog subsists on beer and whiskey and is one of the 3 major characters of the novel. And another major character is a drunken writer. So very literary, but it's a really good read. And I might read another James Crumley. The plotting gets a little confusing, so maybe the one book is enough.
Thank you so much for that. An excellent and original recommendation. We've never had that one on, let me tell you. Professor Bell.
I should have gone first because Bob just talked about a drunk bulldog as a main character. That's hard to beat, so I'm not going to try. Honestly, the book I'm reading right now, I also, like Bob, read a lot of fiction when I get to choose what I read. So I'm finishing up this book right now called His Only Wife by Peace Adso Medie, M-E-D-I-E, about a Ghanaian seamstress struggling to come to terms with the terms and conditions of her marriage to a rich man in Accra. But for the record, if you guys are looking for recommendations on historical fiction, I'm a huge and enduring fan of Edward P. Jones' The Known World. Edward P. Jones is a DC-based writer, as I'm sure many of you know.
Well, thank you both so much. And thank you to everybody out in the audience who joined us this evening. Again, your patronage is what is enabling us to bring content like this into your homes, especially during this pandemic, which, rages on around us. We can't continue to host these type of events without the book sales to support them. So do use those links in the chat to go check out The Failed Promise on Politics and Prose's website, as well as Professor Bell's class, Reading the American Revolutionaries. And while you're there, do check out our calendar of events through, I believe, the beginning of the fall. And stay well, everybody, and stay well read. Thank you so much, gentlemen. Have a great evening.
Thank you, Beth. Thank you, audience. Thank you, Rick.
You're welcome. Be safe.
Congratulations all. Bye-bye.
Thank you.